Hello and welcome to today's 30th webinar in the On the Move webinar series, Improve Facility Performance with Operational Assessments, brought to you by Honeywell Intelligrated. I'm Tracy Niehaus, Director of Marketing for Honeywell Intelligrated, and I'm your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. Please note that this presentation's audio is provided by phone number or through your computer sound system, so be sure to turn up your computer's volume. You may ask an online question at any time throughout today's presentation in the Q&A feature along the bottom of your screen. Simply type your question into the text area and hit send. Questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the presentation, with the exception of technical questions that can be asked and will be answered real time. Please note that we recommend you be hardwired when attending this webinar. A Wi-Fi connection may result in lag time in slides updating and graphics loading. Today's webinar includes polling questions. Please feel free to answer these questions when they appear and be sure to click submit so we can include your response, as we will be sharing the results real time during this live event. If you'd like to revisit key sections of today's webinar, it will be available on demand at intelligrated.com/on-the-move approximately 48 hours after this live event. You will also receive an email in a couple of days with a link to the recorded event. Now on to the presentation, Improve Facility Performance with Operational Assessments. Discussing today's topic will be Doug Fukushima, Executive Director of Operations and Solutions Consulting at Honeywell Intelligrated. Doug is responsible for leading the team at Honeywell, which assists clients with optimizing their DC performance through operational assessments and readiness planning. He has 30 years of leadership experience in supply chain transformation, distribution, and fulfillment, with global operational responsibility for multi-site distribution center networks. Previously, as VP Supply Chain Distribution for Avon, he was the executive sponsor for the North American Network Transformation, managed the implementation of a high-volume, high-tech greenfield DC, and designed the fulfillment and customer experience strategy for the e-commerce business. And with that introduction, the webinar will now begin.
Thanks, Tracy, and let me thank everybody on the line in advance. And the reason for that is I know in previous topics, they've been a little bit more exciting, a little bit more sexy, things like robotics, AMRs, dense storage, voice, things of that nature. So on its face value, a topic like operational assessment seems like it's maybe a little bit dry. Let me just add a quick bit of background, of my background. Although I've been here at Honeywell 6 months and I have 6 years of experience in this industry with Swisslog and Daifuku, the majority of my career was in distribution and fulfillment operations, with 25 years running distribution centers or running distribution centers networks in North America and Europe. So what I'm saying is, essentially, I'm probably like many of you who are on the line today. I had many of the same daily pressures you did for trying to achieve cost per order, your daily throughput, trying to hit your numbers, and managing staff morale, staff hiring, training, and everything else that's changing within the distribution center environment. So from my perspective, it's been exciting for me to be in the industry from this side of the table as a vendor. But at my core, I've always been fulfillment operations guy with a passion to get the most that I could out of my DC operations. So it's from that perspective that I've come to see the value in the occasional operational assessment from both the internal and the external viewpoint. So with that, let's begin. Here are the topics that we're going to try to cover today in the next 35 or 40 minutes. What is an assessment? What are some of the goals that you'd want to expect out of an assessment? The reasons why you would want to conduct an assessment in the first place. How do you plan for one? What can you expect as a result? And then I'll end with a couple of case studies as examples of some prior assessments that we've done in the past. So the first question is, why do an operational assessment? And I think you know the answer to this already. The world is constantly changing. And this is probably the primary reason why we would want to make sure that we stay in tune with things. I can tell you from my own experience that, in the DCs that I've run, and I've designed a few greenfields that we've also run when I was with Avon, whatever is designed and contracted for on paper was valid, I like to say, only for that moment in time. Things change before the DC is even built and you start up. There are consolidations. You may change other things in your network. Marketing may add a whole different line of SKUs. Business changes all the time. So when taken in that light, it really is somewhat, it behooves us to be nimble and constantly reflect on what we have in our facility, because it was designed and constructed, brick and mortar and steel, really only for that point in time with some accommodation for growth. I've listed a couple of reasons, the common reasons I've heard from other DC managers around the country and actually in Europe as well, is the reasons why that were important for them when they were confronted or had to do an ops assessment. The common ones are throughput, productivity, capacity, benchmarking, and the last one is one that they're almost forced into it, and I know I was from time to time. It's when you have a limited capital investment pot available. Maybe it's things that you or your company knows have to be done or should be done, but there just isn't the capital funding right now. So how do you stretch what you have to get to the next period of time before you get those resources? Some of the goals are, the main goals is to optimize utilization of existing assets before implementing additional automation. I read that one point for point, word for word, because I think that's the most important reason to do an operational assessment. As you'll hear when we talk about some other aspects of an assessment, one of the benefits is it is flexible and it doesn't commit you to anything right this moment. You can kind of tweak what some of your ideas are and see if it really is going to yield the results you expect. In the last case study I'll present, I'll actually show an example of how that benefited that particular client. Another reason for an operational assessment is it gives you an idea so you could dimensionalize what the potential opportunity is between what you have and what you might be able to get. Remember, one of the reasons we do an assessment is not to think about all the things we want to add or the new equipment we want to install, but it's to see what kind of improvements we can make with our existing systems and processes without that investment for two reasons. One of them is money, the other is time. You may not have the time to make those kind of changes. Customer service improvements is always one, but you don't hear about that as much unless you're hearing about that from the business itself. But there's always pressure for things like shortening delivery times, or there could be a quality issue with improving order accuracy and reducing the return rates. And this one isn't really given a whole lot of consideration, but an operational assessment could actually help you plan for growth as well as determine what the right phases and implementation schedules should be for a large investment. So the tagline here is optimize utilization prior to investment. So before we talk about what an assessment is, let's talk about what it's not. It's not a performance evaluation of any of the people that are in the facility. What it is, it's more of an evaluation of the tasks that people are assigned to do, but not necessarily how well they're doing them, certainly not on a person basis. It's really about processes. We're not really looking too much at the mechanical equipment. That is a consideration. There are other groups and other teams that can do that, but our focus is on process, and it's certainly not an audit. And to go to the other end of the spectrum, it's not a blue sky wish list where you could kind of like, hey, let's start with a clean slate and start dreaming big. There's a time and a place for that, but during an operational assessment, that's not what that is intended for. So an operational assessment, the key word here is process. It's a process review, and it's trying to optimize what you've got. So we start at the beginning, we go through in the entire flow, although we will focus on the areas that are your particular pain points. Off on the right, there's 4 basic operational states. You guys know what those are, so I'm not going to belabor them. But in almost every case, any piece of equipment or any system could be described as in one of those states. It's either running, which means everything is fine. It's blocked, which means, let's pretend for a moment or assume that it's an order picker. The order picker is blocked. So he or she has work to do, but they can't process any more work because downstream they're blocked and they just can't get any more past them. Starved is just the opposite. They're ready on the line, they're available to work, but no work is flowing to them. so they can't work in that state. And faulted is when you've got some other system issue, usually equipment or an IT issue. I try to tell people that at this point you should concentrate your focus on within the four walls of a facility. Certainly there are things that would make our life easier and more productive if we could reach outside, but it's always, I think, wise to kind of clean up our own house first before we reach outside. Plus, you have the ability in most cases to impact that immediately. If you reach outside your facility, it can take a lot longer. So let's go to our first polling question, which is, what would be your preferred reason to do an operational assessment? So was productivity and cost, throughput volume, DC capacity, benchmarking or your best practices, or order quality and accuracy. And not that these are the only ones, but these are some of the more popular ones. We'll pause for a minute and see what kind of responses come through and share them with you. And at the moment, I don't see anything coming up. But you do, okay. What would a webinar be without a few technical glitches along the way? Okay, I'm looking at another computer, and although more responses might be coming in, the most popular one with over 50%, 54% is on productivity and cost pressures. DC capacity is the second with 18%. Benchmarking, which is a really good one. It's only at 17%, and throughput is 14%. Not too many people at this moment are concerned with order quality, order accuracy, or some of the customer service issues. So that's great. That's interesting. So let's continue on. Oh, I see. If I click twice, I got it. I'm sorry. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about some of the things that are evaluated. We talked about material flow, probably the most important one, but I would say the second one up there, which is product slotting, where you position items within your picking floor, fast moving versus slow moving versus medium moving, whatever, is one of the most important variables and attributes that could improve facility performance. Balancing between functional areas is just what it sounds like. Oftentimes, if there is a line, if you're filling an order, I'm using a very basic example. Filling an order sequentially on a pick and pass, it goes from person to person to person, assuming they all have work that needs to be done for that particular order or tote or whatever. But in some cases, you see that there might be, say, 4 stations along the line. But the balance, the workload between those 4, and you'll never get it perfect, or I was never able to get it perfect, but you want to try to keep it as balanced as you can so you can maintain somewhat of a uniform flow. We see this more often than not, where people have really planned well, but in terms of the labor balancing, it isn't managed as tightly because it varies, minute by minute or hour by hour. And that's something that could affect your productivity and throughput. Of course, bottlenecks, waiting for work, data latencies, which is another situation of starved. Recirculation rates, primarily on things like routing sorters and shipping sorters. You're always going to have some level, but it's an indication of how well you're able to run, and it's also another indication of your staffing. And maybe it's not your staffing, but maybe it's how trucks are being brought into the facility and they're just not staggered or planned well enough so that you can manage and spread out some of that volume. Warehouse utilization, I'll talk a little bit about that later. That's a key one that we would look at if there's problems with getting merchandise out to replenish the floor. And then the other common ones is returns, scanner read rates, downtime, things like that. The last one I have on there is adoption of best practices. And what I mean by that is when we go through a facility, there's a lot of things that we've seen. Most of them are common knowledge that you just observe to see how many customers are doing something similar. So I've got one example here, and I would say probably almost everybody does something like this. But this is an hourly scorecard. It's a timeline in progress that shows what the goals are for the facility, for that shift, and for that group. I kind of compare this, or say there's a lot of similarities between this and a baseball scoreboard. When you go to the ballpark, you can see it. You see that there's 9 innings spread across on the scoreboard. You see the results for both teams after each inning. and at the same time you have the cumulative score over on the far right side. So what does that do? I mean, one of the things it does, and it's very similar here when you're trying to communicate how the team is doing against their goals, is if it's the seventh inning, your team is behind by 2 runs, it kind of tells you, hey, I don't have a lot of time left. I got to try to catch up. You know what? It just gives you some sort of a perspective and context for where you are. On this particular example here I have on the screen, the only thing that I have done differently that I actually am a proponent of is they only have their cumulative goals and cumulative results here, as you'll see, as you go from hours from 7 a.m. to 8 to 9 and so on and so forth. I like to see the individual hour as well as the cum. And I think it's really good that they have the variance, which is a plus and minus. Now this one, it looks like they were all positive. So it's not really the best example. I would hope there'd be something that was negative, at least for that hour, that you would show. But why is this important to share with employees, or why do I think it's important? When I was running a DC, I had a lot of people that were very concerned about what time they were going to get out of work, primarily for things like childcare, what time they had to pick up their kids from school, things of that nature. Or they had to call their family to say, hey, I need to make alternate arrangements, we're working late, we're behind schedule, I need somebody here at home to go pick up the kids at school. These kind of things actually, I think, helped us and helped a lot of clients when the employees are engaged. Sometimes it affects behavior a little bit in terms of motivating, or also at least it's not a surprise at the end of the day. And that's probably one of the most important things. There's no surprises. So the second polling question that I'll ask is, with regard to resources, what would be your preferred approach to conducting an assessment? And there's multiples, but I listed 3. And one of them is if you're doing an assessment with your own internal people, doing one with maybe your own internal people, but bringing people in from other DCs in your network. And another one is using external resources to work with your facility management. So we'll take a moment here and just see, if you would, select one of those, and we'll share the results here in a minute. It's not showing up on my screen. Wow. This is a little surprising to me. First of all, about half of the participants have voted, but most have selected the external consultants working with facility management. I would not have expected that. I would expect it would be a balance of the first 2. There are pluses and minuses to each one of these. And so let me kind of just briefly share my perspective of that. Using your own internal staff and your own key employees is great. They're closest to the problem, they feel the pain, they see what's going on, they know your processes. But it's somewhat of a limited view. They only know what they know, and they've only seen one facility. Bringing experienced SMEs from other DCs in the network, I actually think that was a real effective way to do that. And maybe you could combine that with some consultants if you want to come in and take a look at it. And the plus and minuses there. SMEs from other facilities know the business very well. They may or may not know your facility or your people, so they'll tend to see things a little differently. For right or wrong, they'll see things a little differently. What external consultants can do is they give you a perspective that's really outside of your own business and what you know. I'll share just one comment I got from one customer. It was a an apparel retailer. And I was working with the Senior Vice President of Supply Chain, and what he told me was, I've been here 17 years, is what he told me. And he says, I'm the most junior person here, just about. Most of the management, most of the directors and the executives have been here longer than I have, and I've been here 17 years. I think we've got a really good system here, but we only know what we know. We believe we have a somewhat limited view of what's out in the marketplace and what other people are doing. So that was his justification, and it was interesting when he shared that with me. They had a slightly different issue, but anyways, that's what I think are the pros and cons out of some of those options. So I'm on to the first case study now. Can I, would somebody just send a text if you can see this, because we've had a few computer issues here. But what I'm showing right now is a Title V for case study. And this is a hardware supplier and their issue was PIC module throughput. When I say hardware supplier, it's not the Home Depots of sort, but think of commodities. When you go into a Home Depot and you're doing home improvement, you go into the lighting or electrical section, you know, how many different SKUs are there of just lighting fixtures? And you know, my wife watches HGTV too much. She's had us redo 3 bathrooms at home and a kitchen. I'm not going to tell you how I really feel about that, but I can tell you the number of different finishes on plumbing fixtures and faucets and towel bars and toilet paper holders in terms of design, color, size, style. It seems like it's almost limitless. So this particular customer was in one of those types of commodity businesses. Now, what their issue was, PIC module throughput. They had a good problem, which was they were growing, but along with growth comes with challenges. So what they had decided to do more than a year prior to the time we went in there was they were using vertical carousels for some of their higher velocity, smaller items for picking, and that served their needs well. As they were growing, they decided that they wanted to go to PIC modules in a pick and pass configuration. But what they actually experienced was a 40% productivity decrease. I mean, it's beyond horrendous. Their view of what had happened was that as all these new systems came in, that they believed there was software issues related to replenishment. They thought that their pickers were there ready to pick, and you could see them on the floor, but they could not pick, the replacement could not keep up with picking. So their initial thought was they wanted some programming changes. So we went in there and we reviewed picking as well as replan. So the first one was picking. So you observe what their activities are. You collected a little bit of data like on stockouts and some other things like that, frequency, distribution, and whatnot. Some of the things we saw within the couple of days we were there is we saw a number of empty slots within the PIC module. By a number of empty, I would say it was in excess of 10%, which seems a little high depending on your business. There were a number of slots that were partially filled, and that may have been by design, but it turned out it really wasn't by design. It happened to be due to other issues. They had SKUs that were too large to fit in the assigned PIC slot, whether it was flow rack or whether it was bin shelving. So yeah, maybe they got the velocity right and figured out how to balance it across the 4 stations so they could get load balancing where there are people, but they didn't physically fit in the slot. So if you wanted to fill 20 units in the slot, and you could only maybe get 8 in there because of the physical dimensions. As a result, they were taking these excess items, putting them behind the bin, and unless somebody knew there were some extra pieces there, the bin would appear to be empty. And we also monitored idle time and what other things pickers are doing. On the replenishment side, we took a look at the reports coming out of the system to see, you know, how is it performing, when is the task being generated, and actually following that process through from the task generation to the time that the slot was actually replenished. The observations we had was that in this particular instance, with this particular operation, replenishment had a relatively low priority compared to picking. People were measured, you know, you get what you measure, right? People were measured primarily on picking. So that happened to be the focus. And what was curious is the occurrences of stockouts seemed relatively low for what we were hearing from the client. What we found out was in the system, there was an alternate process that automatically fill shorted merchandise. So if the primary pick location of pick mod was empty, the system would generate a pick from the full case area to tell that person, pull some pieces out of the full case area. They put it on the conveyor, which only went to the shipping dock. And the process was supposed to be, they take it off the conveyor, put it on a pallet, get it back to the pick mod. So there'd be some delay, but they did have a process. The problem was that stuff would sit on the shipping dock on a pallet because it wasn't prioritized for hours. When I say hours, sometimes in excess of one shift. The problem we saw was, or one of the observations was, this process, while well-intended, masks the real problem that you have there. It makes it invisible. You can't see it, and it's not even being captured on your report. So in terms of recommendations, we said, hey, try turning off the automatic alternate picking, or replenishment. It should have been replenishment. And let's just see what the kind of issues we're experiencing. Without a doubt, good or bad, it's going to force the problems to the surface. You could measure it, you could quantify it, and you can change your processes around it. By process, it's probably just a matter of prioritization. You may need an extra person or two here or there, but the benefits far outweigh the cost, because it's not going to impact your picking rate nearly as much. We also saw that the min-max settings for the slots were not set right. Now, they were probably set right at the very beginning when the thing was designed and implemented, kind of like I talked about on the first slide about your world changes, and your design is really only valid, in my view, the day that you sign the contract, because things change outside of your control after that. The min and max have to be monitored and updated at whatever frequency is right for your business. So that was part of the problem with slots being only partially filled. It's because the settings within the system weren't kept current as the SKUs change or the locations change. Dimensions item data is often a little out of whack, and that needs to be managed. And so you need a process just to review that. So the last polling question is, when do you think it's appropriate to do an operational assessment? Again, there's no right and no wrong answer. But do you think it's your preference would it be semi-annually, annually, every other year, or when operational KPIs stagnate or decline or change? So pause for about 10 or 15 seconds to see what comes in. Okay, I'm going to go with what we have. We've got just under 50% of the participants that have responded, and almost, let me see, about a quarter of the people say semi-annually, and about a third of them, of the participants responded that when KPIs stagnate or change. It really depends on your business. I would say definitely number 4, whenever KPIs stagnate or decline, you want to see what's going on. It may or may not require an assessment. I would say semi-annually. If you want to do that, that's fine. I mean, certainly, I'm not sure necessarily the more the better, because sometimes you see the same things over and over again, and that you may not have had a chance really to see the impacts of what you have changed. I think maybe annually, every other year is okay too, depending on the changes within your business. But again, there's no right answer to that. Okay, so with that, when do you do an assessment? Kind of a follow-up from the last polling question. Any or all of these are just reasons why you might want to consider when to do an assessment. And again, it comes back down to when things change. So let's get into our first case study. Oh, I'm sorry, this is our second and our last case study on auto parts remanufacturing. So what this particular customer had was they were remanufacturing alternators for automobiles. So, you know, they typically look something like the photo on the top right side of the slide. But because it was a remanufacturing operation, what they do is they collect them, then they would, in the quick process is they break it down and try to rebuild them and sell them as remanufactured to the auto zones or the track autos or whoever is out there. Their issue was cycle time. At the beginning, when they first started this process, it wasn't an issue. But as their business grew, primarily as volume went up and SKUs went up, that this became an issue. And so there was an erosion of everything that you need, productivity, throughput, but the cycle time was the big killer. And the fourth one I have is new parts and remanufacturing. You can see just an example of some parts that were down below. It's actually not from that particular alternator, but from something else. As they would break them down, what they would do is they would inspect the parts, they would clean them up. A lot of the mechanical components, like the housings and things like that, could be reused. They would always use new nuts and bolts and washers, and they would typically also replace the electrical components like the voltage rectifiers and things like that. But they're trying to reuse as much as they could. So their issue was, the client issue was, hey, you know, our process, maybe it's our assembly line, it's just too slow. So it really worked well until it didn't work well. And The reason why it didn't work well was volume. So I kind of covered this on the last slide. This is a very, very high level. Your total cycle time is from the time that the work order is cut, when they say, hey, we need 150 of alternator type 1 and 200 of alternator type 2 and whatever, because they've got a live order they want to ship out. They go through the core teardown process, they inspect, refurbish, then they start to remanufacture. And then when all the parts are available, they can rebuild whatever they have, off it goes and back into inventory. But they try not to hold inventory, they're trying to ship it out. So it worked well until it didn't. On this particular slide, I've tried to highlight some of the observations. So it's almost the same slide as previous. This was the original process. Well, this still is the original process. But what is in red text are some of the issues that we took particular note of. It's very clear, no work can be done until a work order comes down to the floor. During the remanufacturing process, I talked a little bit about reused parts, and that was one of their concerns here, is that when they're going through the remanufacturing, if parts aren't available to rebuild an alternator, they'll either supplement it with brand new parts, which costs them money, or they will hold and wait until the parts are available. So they tear down more units, recondition more units to bring them out. They tended to err on the hold and wait side because, there was a lot of money involved, but it was impacting their cycle time. To give an example why they thought this was their burning platform, their new parts utilization rate was 35% approximately, when they believed that the competition in this industry was around 10%. So they saw this as a real issue for them. So our recommendation was, well, because you can't, you're tearing units down, reconditioning, trying to assemble and get them out basically in the same time because you don't have a lot of place to store it, and also you don't want to be reconditioning or remanufacturing everything that you've got coming in the door because some of that will never be sold. Stuff changes all the time. You don't want to rebuild alternators that there'll be very little call for in the future. So that part makes sense. So what we suggested to them is, hey, let's develop some sort of parts accumulator. So first of all, when you're tearing down cores, you can't tear down everything willy-nilly, but you have to look further upstream to see what's coming down the pike. So your SNOP process, your sales forecasting, or something like that, you need to tap into a little bit more because you're guessing a little bit more into the future where you weren't doing that in their old world. So you start tearing down those cores, recondition them, and part them in a storage accumulator that we arbitrarily said has 1 week worth of inventory. The fast-moving things were either 2 days worth of inventory, but you also augmented that with new parts so that they were ready almost immediately. So the key here is that the work order release, even though you knew what was coming down, would not be sent to the floor until they had confidence that they had most of the parts they needed, so you would not have that delay. So the benefits of this process, after you decouple the tear down from assembly and implemented this manual, they call it a Kanban, but it's a storage accumulator to manage your work in process, the disruptions almost went away completely because you didn't have that lag time. Labor productivity spiked, but for more than just the fact that you weren't waiting for things, now you're able to tear down larger batches. As long as you might tear it down instead of for just the next week, you might tear it down for 2 weeks back, but you can tear down more at a single time. So what that helps with, every time they change from alternator A to alternator B, they had to clear the line because there's new parts that had to come in. So they had to take all the old reconditioned parts off. They had to bring in the new bins, start tearing down the new ones because it's a different assembly process. And in many cases, they even used different hand tools because the bolt sizes were different and all of that. So cycle time came down. And what we saw as a huge benefit for them was this presents a lower risk. First of all, because it's manual, and this came out of an ops assessment, you could do this immediately, almost immediately. All you need is some racks, some flow racking, and some bins. Plus, you needed to get your systems, spruced up IT systems so you can manage that a little bit better. But this buys you time. Part of the team over at this client site wanted to go right for a shuttle or an ASRS, a mini load crane system for parts. Great. That's nice. It's, nice and sexy and it's shiny and it's automated and all the rest of that. But do you need it? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Does it pay back? I don't know. I mean, you would hope so, but, depending on your volume and all the rest of the things, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. The nice thing it really did for you, though, is it gives you a chance to play with all these different parameters. Balance how far upstream you want to start pulling merchandise. How far you want to recondition in the future. Do I have the right number of bins on flow rack? Do I have the right number of fast-moving parts over on the static rack? You don't know. It was a guess. So it gives you time to play with all this. And when you do decide you want to invest in automation, you've got a much better idea of something that's more tuned to what your eventual needs are. So, some closing thoughts before we get to the Q&A. And I copied this quote right out of something on one of the Honeywell sites here. And I'm going to read it. It's that the next generation technologies and automated material handling solutions, including robotics, autonomous sortation solutions, automated storage and retrieval systems, and more, can certainly deliver significant improvements to operational efficiencies in order fulfillment, as well as address labor and flexibility issues. However, there are other less complex measures that can be taken as well. Operational assessments may highlight improvement opportunities that can yield benefits immediately without requiring capital investments. The following white paper that you'll see on the next last slide describes, it's a white paper that describes 10 steps that can be taken to increase operational efficiency today and into the future. It was a paper that Honeywell published, I guess, some time back, and it's been refreshed from time to time. It is free on our site, and on the previous slide, they had the web link to it, or you can just go on, Tracy, I'm sure will tell you here in a moment how to access it. And you'll also see that link when this presentation is uploaded to the site. So just a quick view. I'm not going to go through these 10 points. Most of you will probably do many, if not all of them right now. But it's not a bad idea just to do a bit of a check-in, see how we're doing, see if we want to modify any of that. And it's especially a good tool when you've got new people either coming into your business, or you've got people that are a little bit more junior to the industry and younger in their career. So with that, let me turn it back over to Tracy.
All right, thank you so much, Doug. I don't know, I think you might have brought operational assessments up onto the same par as some of those other ones you mentioned at the start, robotics and such. But appreciate your time to walk us through that. And as Doug mentioned, we'll move on to the Q&A portion of our event now. As a reminder, you may ask a question online at any time just by checking on that Q&A feature along the bottom of your screen, and we'll be addressing some of those questions. We've had quite a few come in. So our first one is, what is the total time commitment required, and how many of my management staff would need to be freed up to work on an assessment team?
Okay, you could guess at the answer. It depends. All right, and some of the things that I'll give you a typical, but I'll tell you what it depends. Well, let me start with the typical. I would say the minimum we like to do these kind of things, if it's us, is like a day and a half, a full day and a half. 3 to 4 days would be the maximum in most cases, because a lot of times you don't have to do a deep dive throughout every element of the process. Usually there are things that the client says, you know what, we have more concerns, like in those case studies. We have more concerns with replenishment and we're not getting things through, so we'll spend more time there. The number of people involved is also somewhat negotiable. I'd say at a minimum you need a couple of subject matter experts. We like to talk to, as we're going through the operation, some of the operators, the key operators that you will point us to and introduce us to on the floor. Lead people are an invaluable source, and the operations management, the supervisors or managers or whatever their titles may be, is good to help them. It's good to have them accompany us along the way, because there's plenty of questions that come up or that either they have or we have as we're going through this. So I would say, in the general rule, you need 2 to 4 people. Although when we have a kickoff meeting, we'd want to talk to a large group or whatever you decide is the appropriate group. It's usually most of the operations team if we're talking about a DC, and going for a couple of days, 2 to 3 days.
All right, thank you. Next question. How much and what types of data would be required in advance to do an operational assessment?
Sure. Well, as I kind of mentioned on the previous question, what we try to do, and in fact almost insist on, I think it really serves us and you best if we have a pre-discussion first, not just, hey, we're coming down and that's great, we'll be here to meet you, but we want to talk through with you your assessment of the issues and problems, and then from that, we'll probably ask for some data. And let's use the example of the first case study where it was throughput in a pick mod. We'd want to know the number of SKUs, we'd want to know the profiles, we'd probably want to know what your slotting methodology is. I don't want to know how you crank all of the stuff out, but how often do you do it? And is there just one person that knows it, or whatever? We'd want to understand one of the pieces we'd want is a drawing layout beforehand. How you configure your staffing on the floor. How much are your own employees versus temp employees? What your turnover is like. What your SLAs are that you commit to customers. Basically, some of your pain points and your objectives. So that's just a sampling of some of the data we'd look for.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see. Both our retail and e-com business have volume peaks and valleys throughout the year, holiday promotions, back-to-school specials, inventory blowouts, sales, etc. When is the best time prior to perform an assessment?
Well, as we always say, or what we're fond of saying, do an assessment before you need to. I would say that during peak times, whether it's your Christmas holiday season or back to school season or whatever, I know I've seen that with some office supply clients. Their back to school is one of their biggest times of the year. We'd kind of like to see that just to understand what the magnitude of the impact is at your worst case. But if we're really preparing and trying to get better in our operations, are you preparing for the 100-day flood? Well, yeah, a little bit, but there's probably equal, if not more, benefit in just getting, finding that sweet spot for your average operations. We don't want to go in when there's not enough volume, but I would say something north of what your average is good for us to see. We want to see some of the problems, and where we don't see them, we want you to say, you don't see it today, but this is what we see when these conditions occur. We just have a backlog here, or we've got a bottleneck and it backs all the way up to the receiving dock, or whatever. So I would say the best time to do it, we would recommend is not peak, but something between average and peak.
All right, thank you. Okay, our next question. Would this assessment work in other warehouse environments that may not be DC oriented?
Yeah, I want to say yes, because I think an operational assessment, it's really not about distribution per se. I think the things that you look for are almost universal. If you go back to the first couple of slides, what I was trying to underscore and emphasize is this is about a process. We're not assessing equipment, we're assessing a process. What's the flow of materials? How much, what kind of uniform flow do you see? How much idle time do you see where you have people? How much rework is involved? So I think whether it's manufacturing, and that second example, the case study with the alternator remanufacturer, it's not really distribution, but you see a lot of similarities. That was more of a manufacturing type of environment. So I do think there's validity, and you can apply this to almost any type of production environment because you're focused on the process. You're not focused on bins and flow rack and sorters and hardware.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's see. Next question. I manage an older DC, and there have been rumors about management closing our plant. My employees might get nervous seeing a team going around conducting an operations assessment on the factory floor, and perhaps it's too risky to conduct this during work hours. Is this something that can be done on off hours instead?
Well, I've actually, in my own prior life, lived through something like this, where we actually were closing facilities. So it wasn't about operational assessments. Decisions had already been made because of DC consolidations in the network. It is very sensitive. I mean, morale is fragile for people that are nervous, and to see quote-unquote visitors or people that look like they're looking at from the outside can create some anxiety. I would suggest, it's just an opinion rather, that one of the most effective ways to tackle that is to be as open as you can be with associates. Now, if you're not in a position or situation where there's already a decision to close and consolidate facilities or whatever the issue is, But there's anxiety about, we're not as productive as the facility over in Atlanta, or it seems like out of the 5 facilities we have in the U.S., we're, struggling between number 5 and number 6 in terms of our cost per order. I think one of the things, we talked about, the scorecard earlier on, or what I call the baseball scoreboard, and sharing the daily goals. Having employees know how the facility is doing, there's a way you need to communicate that, but I think that's one of the things that helps engagement. It may not be good news, but it can, if you've got the credibility and people will, give you enough faith and believe in you a little bit, that you're not just, spinning a load of hooey at them, and that, hey, this is what we need to do. One of the tactics is, listen, I don't know if they're looking at a facility change or not, or a closure, but the best defense we have is to strengthen our own position, is to try to get our, whatever it is, our throughput up, or cost per unit down, or the customer service, fewer complaints. And, we definitely, want to put ourselves in the strongest position. But that's a tough one. The second part of your question is, can it be done off hours? I would say, technically, yes, but I would say with very limited value. You need to see the stuff running, and you need to talk to people.
All right, fair enough. Next question. Is it safe to assume operational assessments address multi-location operations, such as inventory is moved between multiple locations?
This is not interactive where I can ask the person, but if it's within the building, yes. But if it's something like, when I had multiple DCs across the country, you have limited inventory coming in for whatever the commodity is. My old world was cosmetics, so let's say it's, lipsticks or whatever. And trying to get that balance right so you get the demand right between 5 or 6 DCs, it wasn't me, it was the SNOP group, it was marketing and all the rest of those projections that came out. And they would, determine how that inventory would be split across the DCs in the U.S. For us and what we do in ops assessments, we typically would not want to get into that. And if I go back to one of the points I made earlier, try to stay within your own 4 walls. Not that you shouldn't tackle some of these other issues, but if you don't have control over them, it's like trying to push water uphill. You may get there, but it may be limited, and it's certainly going to probably take a lot of time, is what I would anticipate. So I would say outside of your DC, I would probably not want to tackle that.
Okay. Next question. During your opening comments, you mentioned that an ops assessment can be a tool to help you plan for future growth, but it sounds like the main objective is to optimize utilization of your existing assets. So the question is, can you speak to how exactly an ops assessment can be used as a tool to plan for future growth?
That's actually something I was considering to use one of the 2 case studies, and I opted to select the 2 that I did. Let me see, I think I might have one slide as my alternate. Let me see if I can find it. And I don't have all the background on it, but I could just talk through that, at least conceptually. Okay. This is it. And this is an eye chart. It's hard to read. So let me see if I can restate the question. An ops assessment is really focused on optimizing what you have, trying to understand what the opportunity gap is between where you are today and what you might be able to achieve without major changes or no changes, to really focus on the process. But the question, can you use this, or has it been used before to help you plan for the future? While it's not the primary focus, the answer, I think, is yes. In this example, and what I'm showing here on the screen, this is real data. It's unbelievable. Look, this is real data. Now, this is how many years out? I don't know. It's 9 years out, and I would say anybody who's trying to project more than 3 years at most, you might as well be, it's the pie in the sky. You have no idea what you're looking at. But this particular business, and this was only one DC for this particular country. This is when I was working in Europe. This particular DC was experiencing explosive growth. It was a new market entry. And they were also in an environment where labor was extremely hard to come by. And when you talk about labor that's reliable, that you can count on, that will show up from day to day and not, just decide not to come back after Wednesday, they had their challenges with that. So if you look at, on the bottom here, it shows what the projected growth is. After year 1, this next year, it was 54% projected growth. They actually hit that, that region, so that was actually pretty close. The next year, marketing was projecting, what does that say? I can't even read it, 31% and then 33%. But after a while, they even acknowledged that they were just, guessing at, which way the wind's going to blow. So they just kind of leveled it out after that point at 7%. But I would tell you that all that is almost worthless. Their change was confronting them, and they had very little time because they were a new business and things were changing rapidly. They could not implement automation even if you gave them a bag full of money and have it in time. The calendar was more against them than the financial resources were. So that first year one, what that green line is showing the capacity, and this is after we've already done an ops assessment. So, everything we spoke about up to this point, assume that it's done. We've tweaked everything we can. We've re-looked at their processes. We changed their labor models. We've, all those kind of things. But the green line shows what the capacity was. Every line that you see here, blue line, is 1 week's worth of volume. And their particular market had this kind of volatility. Their sales cycle was 3 weeks long, but almost a highly disproportionate of that volume came in week one. When everybody wanted it, goes on sale, everybody wants the thing. So the second week and third week were much less. So that first week was a killer. So in that first year, you see the green line at the first half of the year. Every time that you see a blue line for volume go above the green line means that they couldn't do it in their normal capacity. So what do? You don't have a whole lot of choices. You may have money. They didn't at that time. You don't have time. So the levers start pulling ours. Let me look at overtime. Let me look at maybe an extra shift or something like that. So mid-year, you see that it says a second shift introduced. So again, labor was their issue. They couldn't get people to come back to work in this particular country, in that particular market. But they had to introduce a second shift. They had to pay more. They had to implement more management to help them plan. So you can see mid-year, the green line for the next half of the year. Most of the blue bars are below that green line. So they're able to do that with overtime. Business continues to grow. So that's survival one. That's the survival plan one. What they did is they added another assembly line to the floor, but these were very manual assembly lines, so it was some pain involved, but you could actually do it. So you can see how that with every step they did, this kept the blue volume lines underneath the green lines, with as few exceptions as you could. You look at the second half of the year, where it shows survival 2, 4 lines. Now, you could only get 4 lines in this building. There was no more real estate. You were maxed out at this point. You can't add any more bedrooms onto your house because you're run out of land on your plot. Shows that you've got 3 weeks there that exceed the green capacity. What you see in the red line between years 3 and years 4, that's an infrastructure change. That was with automation. That was putting in a mezzanine. That was putting in some of the stuff that, many of you use today. And so it shows the capacity would take them well into the future, assuming those volume projections by marketing are right, which they never are. But, the tool or the value here is you did everything you could to improve your operations. You've done all the tweaks. You've added a line, so you're demonstrating to your own management and your own executive board and board of directors who are going to approve your capital expenditures what you've done. And when you show I've hit the wall here, it shows what the red line is, and this is what we can do. So it also bought them 2 years, and they were painful years, but it bought them 2 years where you could get the justification, you could get the planning, because you can't just say, hey, I want a pick-to-light system with a shuttle, and by the way, all this other stuff. It takes time. It takes time. But once that was implemented at the end of year 3, you didn't have to run all the lines anymore. Maybe you want to, maybe you don't. Maybe you can get everything done on the first shift and not worry about those labor issues you have on second shift. It's so hard to get people. So it gives you flexibility. So do you have excess capacity? Yeah, but maybe you could do it more effectively. Maybe your cost per order now goes down because you could do it on one shift. And you have some productivity improvements, just the fact that you've got some automation. So actually, this is an example that was pretty powerful in justifying to not only the executive management within supply chain, but the board of directors for a Fortune 500 corporation, what their plan was, demonstrated they've done everything they could, and showed what they would get when they did it. And they had time to do it. So
great.
anyway.
Well, thanks. No, that was very interesting. I think that's about all the time we have for questions today. So thanks to all of our attendees for their participation. And if we were unable to answer your question during today's live event, we will send you a response via email. As a reminder, within approximately 48 hours after this live event, you can access this presentation on demand at intelligrated.com/on-the-move. And as Doug mentioned, you'll also receive an email in a couple of days with a link to the white paper, 10 Steps to Improve Operational Efficiency. On behalf of Honeywell Intelligrated, thank you for attending today's On the Move webinar. We will share registration information about our next webinar in the coming weeks, and we hope that you'll be able to join us then. Have a great afternoon.